One of the things I want to draw your attention to, if you like going to archaeology lectures, and who doesn't, the AIA is doing something called the Archaeology Hour, the virtual Archaeology Hour. They started this during COVID. They're still doing it. It's monthly. They have a really excellent speaker. They kind of vary the dates, but this month is starting in September 25th, so next week. The free monthly virtual lectures, you have to you just go on the website, the AIA website, and you just have to register for it, and they'll send you the Zoom link. So they're excellent. We have links for all that on our own webpage, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there's lots of ways to get involved worldwide, nationally with archaeology, but there's lots of ways locally. I wanted to flag this up. Spokane Archaeology Day is coming up. It is, I'm not even sure how many years we've done it. COVID is warping my mind, but it's a free event that we do on the grounds of the MAC just out there on October 5th. There's all kinds of archaeologists, historians, cultural heritage folks that come, and they have great demonstrations of what we do as archaeologists. For all ages, highly recommend you come. You can come bother me. I'll be working a booth, or say hi to me, whatever you prefer. But highly recommend you come along to that. Our society, we have a webpage, SpokaneAIA.com. You'll always find links to who's speaking that month, who's coming up, as well as other information there. And then we are still doing a lot of these lectures hybrid through Zoom. So if you can't make it in person, and sometimes in January, it's very difficult to get around Spokane in person at night, they'll be Zoomed out, okay? So you can always watch it on your computer as well, and there'll be links to it on our webpage. We also have a newsletter. If you want to sign up for a newsletter, it's an electronic newsletter that goes out every few months, generally quarterly, I believe, done by our own Dr. Rachel Horowitz, who is on our board. This one just went out, I believe, a week or so ago. So if you got it, great. If you're signed up and you didn't get it, check your spam folder or come and give us your email and we'll send it to you again. And we're still on Facebook. I guess Facebook's still there. And so we do every month tell who is coming to speak for that. So that's another avenue you can find out what we're doing as a society. Finally, through the generosity of a lot of our speakers, we are recording some of these, and it's always dependent upon what the speaker wishes or not, and we put them on our YouTube channel. So if you really like the talk or you missed it, it might be on our YouTube channel. And we have a link on that to that YouTube channel on our website as well. And it's kind of fun to go back and see what people have presented. We've had repeat speakers, so you sometimes can see how the research has changed over time. So upcoming events, as I mentioned, Spokane Archaeology Day is coming up. Next month, we have Dr. Andrew Goldman of Gonzaga, our former president of society. He's coming back, and he's giving a talk on his work on Gordian. And for those of you that remember the 75th anniversary dinner, we had another speaker on the same thing, but Dr. Goldman will be talking on the Roman occupation of that site a little bit later on. And then we have Dr. Tiffany Fulkerson of Spokane Falls Community College coming to give a chat about her work in the Inland Northwest in November. Okay, so I'd like to read the land acknowledgement that the museum has and we also support. We would like to honor the original people of the lands on which we stand by recognizing this as the traditional homeland territory of the Spokane tribe. Their presence here, since time immemorial, can be seen and felt within these museum walls and in the surrounding landscapes. With gratitude, we'd like to extend a thank you to the Spokane's past, present, and future for sharing this space as a place for artistic and cultural expressions to be enjoyed by all. So as a reminder, we are videoing this. Thank you very much to our speaker, but we ask you not to do so. The AIA respects the intellectual property of its presenters and asks that the viewers do the same. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Okay, that's a lot of the housekeeping. Let's get to what we're here for, right? So tonight is a memorial lectureship in honor of Charles Eliot Norton. Charles Eliot Norton, 1879, the professor of the history of art at Harvard University, along with 11 other associates, founded the AIA. And this lectureship is named in his honor. It was founded, the lectureship was founded in 1909. So it's been around for a while. That has been founding funding, excuse me, people to come and give talks all at local societies across the country. So since its beginnings, the Norton Lectureship has shifted a little bit about who they're inviting and how they're funding it, but it is always kind of a distinguished lectureship. We bring distinguished archaeologists and eminent scholars to come and chat about their research. And so we're very delighted tonight to have our speaker tonight, who is Professor Turi King of the University of Bath, who will be talking to us tonight about King Richard III, the resolution of a 500-year-old cold case. Professor King has a long and varied history focused on archaeology as well as on DNA fingerprinting. Dr. King began her work at the University of British Columbia. Found out tonight she's from Vancouver originally, so not too far away, even though she traveled from the UK to be with us here today. Began her work at British Columbia and then moved on to the University of Cambridge before finally going to the University of Leicester. She was one of the first team members approached by the lead archaeologists excavating the Grey Friars monastery about the topic we're going to talk tonight. And I don't want to spoil too much about that talk. I'll let her give that presentation, but wanted to say that Dr. King has recently become the director of the Milner Center for Evolution at the University of Bath. And beyond her work across the UK, is also working with the Jamestown Recovery Team in Virginia. So please join me in welcoming Professor Turi King. Get mine out of the way.
There you go.
Get yours up.
Oh,
Thank you so
great.
much.
No, thank you. Okay. Make sure this is working. So I am going to give you a bit of a gossipy, whistle-stop tour through the Richard III project. And as you've heard, I've got a bit of an unusual background. So I started in archaeology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And I had been doing that for a couple of years, and I decided to kind of go over to the UK and Greece and do excavations there. And I kind of thought, well, if I go back to UBC to finish my degree, it'll be 2 years. But if I go to Cambridge, it'll be 3 years. So I applied on a little bit of a whim and got in. And I read for archaeology and anthropology, and I specialized in biological anthropology. And it was there that I got really interested in how you can use genetics to answer questions in history and archaeology. So I was asking around all of my tutors. I'd really like to go and learn genetics. And they all said, well, actually, don't stay at Cambridge. The best place to go is the University of Leicester. So I went there, and I was really lucky. I did my master's, my PhD, and my postdoc there. And on my PhD panel was this guy. So this is Sir Alec Jeffreys. This is the guy who invented DNA fingerprinting. And all of my research was combining history and archaeology with genetics. I did a lot of work on the link between hereditary surnames and a piece of DNA known as the Y chromosome, which I'll chat to you about in a little bit. I did some work on the genetic legacy of the Vikings in the north of England. So this is looking at people alive today to see if you could see anything in their DNA about the Viking migrations. And then I became professor of genetics and public engagement at the University of Leicester, which was a role which was created specifically for me. And I'm now the director of the Milner Center for Evolution at the University of Bath. So this project actually started with this lady. So that is Philippa Langley, and she was the secretary of the Scottish branch of the Richard III Society. And way back in 2011, she rang up Richard Buckley, who's the co-director of University of Leicester Archaeological Services, which is a commercial arm of the university's archaeology department. And the way he tells it is he's on the phone for about an hour and a half with this lady who's really passionate about finding Richard III. And he gets off the phone, he thinks, yeah, well, we're never going to find Richard III. But this would be a really interesting project to do because it would be excavating in a part of downtown Leicester that you normally don't get to excavate in. It's a kind of a protected area. So June the 1st, 2011, I get this email. And it basically says, hi, we're going to be doing this excavation in downtown Leicester, and we're looking for the remains of somebody who's quite famous, but I can't tell you who it is. And I write back and is this Richard III? Because when I very first got to the UK, my aunt is really interested in Richard III, and she took me to the Bosworth battlefield. And so she'd given me books on Richard III, and so I wrote back, is this Richard? And he goes, yes, it is, but don't tell anybody, we're never going to find it. Okay, anyway. So what happens is it becomes pretty clear when Philippa is on the phone to Richard Buckley is that she hasn't got any money. So what he does is he introduces her to this lovely chap. So this is Richard Taylor. And Richard Taylor was the kind of head of external affairs at the university. And he, she came up and he has this kind of secret interest in Richard III. And he said, look, we'll do this as a partnership. The university will put money in, but we'll also put in stuff in kind. So you'll have people's time, we'll cover various costs, this kind of thing. So she really lucked out that she met Richard Taylor, who was willing to come on to this. So let's show you what she thought about that when she kind of first came and approached the university.
The role of the University of Leicester in this project has been critical from day one that they found out about it. You probably know with most projects, people can get excited about things, but then that excitement will wane and they'll drop out and things happen. But with the university, they got it. They got it from day one. And their excitement, their interest, their wanting this project to happen, it never foundered. And without them, we wouldn't be here today.
So it was this really lovely project. So the university agreed to underwrite Leicester City Council's contribution for them. And what it was loads of people coming together to fund this project. The University of Leicester by far and away funded the vast majority of this project. The Leicestershire Promotions at one point, they pulled out a little bit of money. So Philippa did a whip round of the Richard III Society, and they put in a little chunk of the money. But obviously what happens is when you do an excavation, not only have you got the excavation itself, but a lot of people who are not in archaeology, you guys will know this, is the post-excavation is huge amounts of work and takes a huge amount of money to do. So the university kind of covered all of that. So as I say, so I get this email from Richard Buckley, and I'm the first person who's brought onto the project way back in 2011. But once everything kind of comes together, you need to have other people come on board. So you've got Matthew Morris, who was our fieldwork director. So he's directing the excavation day to day. Joe Appleby, who was our lovely osteologist on the project. Kevin Schur, who led on the genealogy side of things with quite a large team. And then you've got Sarah Hainsworth, who led on the forensic engineering. And I'll show you some of her work as we go through. But it was this really lovely project because no one person could have done this project on their own. It took loads and loads of people from different departments around the university, but also different universities around the world. And it was people with all different backgrounds. So academic, non-academic. So I really loved this project because it was multidisciplinary and it feels like it was greater than the sum of its parts. It was just this wonderful project to all come together. The other thing I really like is all of the science was led by women. Okay, so who's Richard III and why is he so interesting? Okay, so he is the last king of England to die in battle, and he died in the last main battle of the Wars of the Roses. And to understand how the Wars of the Roses started, you have to go up to this guy. So that's Edward III. And normally what's going to happen is the crown is going to pass down through his eldest son and then down to his eldest son, down through the generations. But unfortunately for Edward III, his eldest son died before he did. And so the crown then passes down to Richard II, who's only about 10 when he comes to the throne. Now, he's obviously quite young, so his uncle, John of Gaunt, is essentially helping him rule the country. Richard II grows up, John of Gaunt dies, and his son Henry decides he wouldn't mind actually being king. So Richard II dies in slightly unusual circumstances. It's said that Henry essentially has him put to death. And then Henry becomes Henry IV. And the crown then passes down through the generations, as you might expect, until you get down to Henry VI. Now, if you look at it with our modern eyes, clearly Henry VI had a mental illness. There were long periods where he was unable to rule the country. Now, there's this other noble family around. So this is Richard, Duke of York. So that's not Richard III. This is Richard III's dad, Duke of York. Richard III was actually Duke of Gloucester. And he's got a pretty good claim to the throne himself. So not only through the male line, but through his mother's line as well. And he's named as protector of England. And this is where the tensions start to arise, just because he's got this quite good claim to the throne. So this is where the Wars of the Roses kick off. And Richard is killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, but his cause is taken up by his eldest son, Edward IV. And through the Wars of the Roses, the crown passes back and forth a couple of times between these two until Henry VI is killed in slightly unusual circumstances. Edward IV then gets a really nasty cold and dies. And then Richard III comes to the throne in slightly unusual circumstances. So it's rumored that he had his two nephews killed so that he could come to the throne. But you would think that'd be it, right? So nobody else to make a claim to the throne. This guy comes along. So you have got Henry Tudor. Now he's descended from a liaison between John of Gaunt and his mistress, later wife, Catherine Swynford. And he's from a line that is banned from ever taking the throne. But that doesn't stop him. So we know that Henry and Richard meet at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August, 1485. Richard is killed. Henry becomes Henry VII. And he marries Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth. And that's apparently where the Tudor rose comes from. It's uniting those two houses. So why Leicester? Okay, so we know that Richard, he knows that Henry Tudor is going to invade, and he's got himself quite nicely centrally placed up in Nottingham, just north of Leicester. And he hears that Henry Tudor has landed in Wales and is essentially making his way up to what's known as the A5 highway down to head into London, right? So he's going to try and stop him from getting there. So he starts to amass his troops in Leicester. So this is what we think medieval Leicester looked like at the time. It was a walled city. We have got three places of interest to this story. So we've got the Blue Boar Inn, the Bow Bridge, and the Grey Friars. So apparently what happens is Richard comes down and he stays in this kind of little boutique hotel, which is known as the White Boar. And Richard's symbol is the White Boar. Apparently after the battle, so as not to upset Henry Tudor, it hastily repaints itself and becomes the Blue Boar Inn. So Richard comes down, he stays overnight, he's assembling his troops, and then he goes out over what's known as the Bow Bridge. And there's a story here. So apparently as he's going out over the Bow Bridge to go to the Bosworth battlefield, he knocks his spur on the edge of the bridge. And apparently this old crone says to him, where you knocked your spur is where you're going to knock your head on the way back. So she's prophesizing things are not going to go well. And indeed, we know they don't. So apparently Richard is, he's in the battle and he's up on a little bit of a ridge, kind of away, with a few of his kind of troops around him. And he sees Henry Tudor, who again is kind of at the back. And he's kind of away from the rest of his men. So Richard gets a few of his men around him. It's like he's going to do a death or glory charge. He's going to try and get Henry Tudor himself. So he goes down this kind of little ridge and his horse gets stuck in a marsh. And he comes down off of his horse and he gets close enough to Henry Tudor to kill Henry Tudor's standard bearer. So this is the guy who would be standing right next to him. And then he is apparently killed by Henry Tudor's men. And we know about this. There's a lot of historical documentation about what happened to Richard. So this is what's known as the Rouse Roll. And for those of you who can't read medieval Latin, I suspect that some of you probably can read medieval Latin. But for those who can't read medieval Latin, here's a handy dandy translation. So basically it talks about how Richard is killed in the thickest press of battle. And then he is brought back and he's buried in the choir of the Church of the Grey Friars in Leicester. So we know that Richard has been stripped naked, flung over the back of a horse. He's brought back into Leicester. He is laid out for a couple of days in a church so people can go, yep, that's Richard III. He's actually dead. And then he's taken and he's buried in the choir of the Church of the Grey Friars in Leicester. That we think is the 25th of August, 1485. 1538, you get the dissolution of the monasteries. So this is Henry VIII. He's having a spat, the Pope in Rome, and he's tearing down the monasteries. And this is where the precise location of Richard's grave gets lost. So lots of the stone from the friary actually ends up in the cathedral, St. Martin's Cathedral, the Leicester Cathedral, which is just over the road from the friary. So Richard's grave is starting to become lost at this point, but we have some hints. So this is Robert Herrick. He's the 3-time mayor of Leicester. And he buys the land that the friary was on. And he seems to think he knows where Richard is buried. And we know about this because this is Christopher Wren. So this is not Christopher Wren who built St. Paul's Cathedral in London. It's his dad. He's basically acting as a tutor to Robert Herrick's nephew, and he comes for a visit. And he writes about how he's been shown in Robert Herrick's garden a handsome stone pillar, 3 foot high, with this inscription: "Here lies the body of Richard III, sometime King of England." That's 1612. Now, if anybody is going to know where Richard was buried, it would be Robert Herrick, because he was born not long after the dissolution of the monasteries. There could have been friars still around, that kind of thing. He thinks he knows where Richard is buried. The reason why that is interesting is because of this. So this is a chap called John Speed. He's a well-known cartographer. And in 1610, he does this map of Leicestershire. And he has on it a map of Leicester. And he has nice little pictures of the battle. And he's talking about how in 1610, Richard's grave is overgrown with weeds. And then the following year, he talks about how there's this rumor about how Richard was dug up during the dissolution of the monasteries and thrown into the local River Soar. Now, we don't know where John Speed is getting this from, but if we don't even know if he actually even came to Leicester himself, because apparently they would have minions that would go out and do this kind of thing. If he did come, he wasn't fantastic as a cartographer because he got the friaries the wrong way around on his map. But it was interesting, right? So there's this rumor that Richard's in the local river. Now, there's been a lot of historical scholarship which showed that this is unlikely to be true. So you have got Bilson. He's writing in 1920, and he's talking about, no, there's no reason to believe that rumor. Richard's probably in, if there's anything left of the friary down in downtown Leicester, that's probably where he is. And then that is taken up and written about by a Ricardian in the Ricardian magazine. So this is a lady called Audrey Strange, and she's writing about this in 1975, again saying, nope, there's no reason to believe that Richard's in the river. He's probably in whatever's left of the friary. You then have David Baldwin, who 1986, he's a lecturer at the University of Leicester. And if you look at the second paragraph of this paper, he goes, nope, he's drawing on this previous scholarship, and he's saying, no, Richard is probably in whatever's left of the friary. And the second to last paragraph says, maybe one day in the future, archaeologists will be digging in this part of Leicester, which is now covered by a car park and buildings, and maybe they'll find the remains of Richard III. And what rather sweetly, he passed away a few years ago, but lived long enough to see what he predicted come true. This then went out in 1993. So this was all picked up by the press. So it was in the Daily Telegraph, and they were there and they're saying Richard III could possibly be under this car park and buildings. And then it was written about by this chap called John Ashdown Hill in his book. And it was apparently this book, which Philippa read, which kind of started her on this quest. So living in Leicester, it is pretty hard not to know about Richard III. We've got a Richard III road. We've got a Richard III statue. It used to be in the Castle Gardens. It's now outside the Richard III Visitor Centre. We have a Richard III pub. And a few years ago, when I used to give this talk, I used to say to people, don't go there late at night. It is so rough. It's really rough. I'm not kidding. So the guy who used to run it is now in jail for manslaughter. But it's a really lovely pub now. So it's this nice kind of pub. So if you do go to Leicester, it's a lovely pub. Do go now. We've got Richard III beer. So this is on that bridge that goes out over the river. We've got Richard III's symbol, the white boar. There are 2 plaques. So this one is next to the bridge, and it talks about, this idea that Richard III used to be in the local, in the river, and it's talking about how he knocked his spur. So there's that little kind of story there. This one is basically saying, so it's from the Victorian period, and it's saying, we think Richard III is in the river now. So there is actually a new plaque like next to it that basically says, yeah, no, this is no longer true. And when I very first got to Leicester and I went around the cathedral, this was in the floor of the cathedral, which basically said, yeah, the remains of Richard III are thought to lie somewhere within the parish, in the Grey Friars nearby, essentially. So what were we looking for? Okay, so Richard, we know he's in the choir of the Church of the Grey Friars in Leicester. He's age 32 when he died, and he's likely to have battle injuries on him. We know quite a bit about how he died in battle, but it is possible to die in battle and have no injuries on your skeleton, because you could just bleed to death. So we think we might find a skeleton with battle injuries, but we're trying to keep an open mind. Possibly a hunchback with a slight build. Now, obviously, this is not terminology that we use these days. This is Shakespeare. So he's writing over 100 years later. He calls Richard a bunchback toad, and he gives him a limp and a withered arm just for good measure. You know, he's a proper kind of villain in this thing. But, you know, Shakespeare's writing in the Tudor period. He's not going to say Richard III was, you know, lovely and he was great with kids and we killed him. They're going to say he was awful, right? So we have to bear this in mind. So you have to look at contemporary sources. So people who knew Richard when he was alive, do they say anything about what he looked like? So we've got two. One is from John Rouse, who did that Rouse roll, which I showed earlier, and basically talks about him having a short face and unequal shoulders, the right higher and the left lower. So possibly a spinal abnormality. And then you've got Nicholas von Poplau, who's described as an itinerant Silesian knight visiting England. So to me, it sounds like a teenager who's gone over to Europe on, like, you know, a holiday, right? And he talks about how he's met Richard and that Richard is 3 fingers taller than he is, but then doesn't tell you how tall he was. So you can't work out how tall Richard was, but basically talks about him being lightly built, slender arms and thighs, and a great heart. So going into the project, we archaeologists basically had 5 main aims. And the first is, can we find the Franciscan Friary buildings? And if we can we work out which bits we found? If we can do that, can we find the church? And more specifically, can we find the choir within the church? And finally, can we locate the mortal remains of Richard III? And we attached a set of probabilities to these. So we never really thought that we would find Richard III, and little did we know we would actually do number 5 before we did any of the rest of them. So this was the day before the excavation started, and the university and the Richard III Society, did this press release, and we thought, is anybody going to be interested in this? And suddenly all of these like news trucks start turning up, and they're pulling into the car park with their big like satellite dishes on. And they are filming every single piece of this car park. And they're like, yep, Richard III could be right under here. Except the one place they didn't film was where we actually found, because they'd parked right on top of the guy. Little did I know when I took this photo what it would be. So this was the day before. And our press team at the university went round and kind of talked to all the main characters and said, what do you think is going to happen? And this is what they said.
Today, we are starting a search here at Grey Friars for the remains of King Richard III, who there is evidence that suggests is buried somewhere under this car park.
The possibility of finding Richard's grave, Richard's tomb, is it's chance.
This is the first search for an English anointed king, and here we are in a car park, underneath which could be one of the most important historical figures in English history.
We don't know very much about the layout of the church, the layout of the monastery, the priory. So whatever we find will be new information.
Was buried in the vicinity. The question is, are his bones still here?
I'm optimistic. If we find a skeleton, there are techniques that will allow us to get DNA out of the house.
Well, we'll be doing well if we find the lines of walls and floors that relate to the primary buildings. That's the great expectation.
Whether we find Richard, whether we don't find Richard. For me, this project was all about the looking for Richard. In fact, the first sort of working title I gave it was Looking for Richard in Search of the King. It wasn't finding Richard.
Cautiously optimistic.
Even if we don't find Richard's remains, it will still be a tremendously exciting fortnight.
So where do you start excavating? Okay, well, this is the first really detailed map of Leicester. It's Thomas Roberts' 1741 map, and it has on it the Grey Friars. So this is not the friary. This is the land that Robert Herrick bought. And you can see on it, so he has his manor house, and he's got his garden, and he's got his orchard here. But it's such a good map. You can do what archaeologists do all the time, which is so map regression, you just overlay it with a modern Ordnance Survey map. And this is what you get. So this gives you your search area. So we know the Friary Precinct is in red. In blue are buildings. Outlined in dark blue are 3 car parks. So we've got this one here, we've got this one here, and then we've got a wall there, and that's the Alderman Newton School playground there. So what we're going to do is, so this is the one that we can actually excavate in. So we've basically got about 17% of the Friary Precinct that we can actually excavate in, but we've only got the money to do 1%. So it's decided what we're going to do is we're going to do 2 long, thin trenches staggered down this. Richard Buckley has been excavating in downtown Leicester for ages. What basically we want to do is see if we can find the Friary walls. So we're going to run 2 long, thin trenches down this main car park. This car park, oddly enough, was the social services car park for, given what Richard was supposed to have done to his nephews, child protection. You couldn't make it up. So we're going to run these two long, thin trenches down here. So contrary to what you might have heard, and this was a bit of a joke on the first day, because we're like, oh, look, there's an R on the car park reserve, right? He'll be right under there, surely. We'll do a 1 meter by 1 meter test trench. We'll go straight down. He's bound to be under there. He wasn't. He's basically where the photographer was taking this photo. The photographer is Carl Vivian. So he's about a bay and a half up from where he was, but it's this huge kind of urban myth now that he was found under the R. He wasn't. So this is the 25th of August, 2012. So 527 years to the day when Richard was buried in the Grey Friars, if you don't mind the calendar changeover. And we're starting to put our trenches in. And 6 hours, 34 minutes in, eagle-eyed Matthew Morris spots a little bit of leg bone. So he stops the digger and he hops into the trench because he wants to know, like, is this a random bit of leg bone, or is it just, is it attached to anything? So he hops in and he does a quick feel. He goes, yep, there's a skeleton under there. So let me show you this. This is the moment that Matthew Morris found Richard III.
I'm not removing it down. I need to find out whether it's an articulated skeleton or whether it's a bit of its bone. Articulated skeleton, I believe in the most. Let's try and see if you've got one more bone you can see attached. Yeah. And if you got a neck. We've got to speak. No. Presumably not so much that they
Well, we don't know.
put that together again. Slow.
No, but we don't know what it's going on there.
Right. What we'll do, we'll cover them up.
So I think this is where the skill of the archaeologists really shows. Archaeology is very, very skilled work. You have to be able to have an eye for soil changes. The other thing about Leicester is it's urban archaeology. So you have a lot of intercutting layers. So you have to be able to spot this stuff. And this is where Philippa's really lucky that she contacted ULAS, because they have that 30, 40 years of experience of working in downtown Leicester and know what they're doing. So we've now found this skeleton. You cannot just excavate skeletons willy-nilly. You have to get a license to excavate human remains. We have got already money in the budget. We can lift up to 6 sets of remains, but we're going to be making some intelligent decisions and ethical decisions about which ones we're going to go for. You're not going to do the first 6 that you find. We know what we're looking for. We're looking for somebody in the choir of the Church of the Grey Friars who's about the right age, et cetera, et cetera. We don't know where we are at this point. It's 6 hours and 34 minutes in. We could be inside the church. We could be outside the church. We want to keep excavating to get a bit of a map as to where we are, and then we will start to home in on skeletons. So the excavation keeps going.
That's stone. Well, yeah, it could be some story. Someone's actually, it's probably down. Well, very, yeah, so many showers, right? I've seen it before. Yeah, let's put on for that, the student, Yeah, I'm looking forward. Forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's.
Yeah, so medieval shower tray aside, we did start to find bits of the building. So we start to find some really interesting stuff. So we have got things like a medieval silver penny. We have got what looks like benches. And there's another set facing this one. So given the size of what we think this room is, we're starting to think that this is the chapter house. And then in trench 2, it looks like we've come down on a cloistral walk. So there's a nice little walkway, there's a doorway and a step down. So we think we might have found a cloistral walk. So this was our little blog that went out. Relatively little to report right now. Richard III's still dead. Little do we know we've actually have found him already. We're just really excited because we think we found a building that's medieval in date. And this is where we think we are. So these are those 2 long, thin trenches. Those are those benches. We think that might be the chapter house. We think that might be the eastern cloistral wall. So friaries have got standard layouts, essentially. So we're starting to kind of work out where we are. And Richard Buckley knows all this. He's been excavating in downtown Leicester for 40 years. So he knows all of this. And what we have found up here is that grave and what looks like a big robbed out wall. So this is where people have come along. They've taken the bits of stone that they're interested in, and they're kind of leaving ghosts of walls of where things used to be. So now churches for friaries can either be to the north or the south, but we've got that kind of big, thick wall. So we're starting to think, okay, so maybe the church is up there. So it's decided we're going to put another trench in, and we're going to put it here in the Alderman Newton playground. We're going to put another trench in to see if we can come down on the church. And pretty quickly, it looks like that's what we've done. So we've got a very basic north wall and a south wall. We've got what looks like choir stall footing. We have this huge stone coffin, which thank goodness we found it on the very last day, because we probably would have thought that was Richard. Went back and did another excavation the following year, and this was removed. And inside was a little old lady in a lead coffin. So we now call her Lil for short. And she's been somebody's project. So it looks like we've basically come down on the presbytery end. And that skeleton that we found on the very first day is actually down at one end of the choir. Let's go and have a look at this. Let's make that the first one of our 6 skeletons that we've got the money to excavate. So this is the day that Matthew found the skeleton. I got a phone call saying, hey, we found human remains. So this is Philippa. And I said, oh, yeah, I'm going to come down anyways. I was going to take some cookies to the guys and bring the family down. So that's me peering into the trench with my daughter, who is now 20 and could probably give this talk for me now. Essentially, she knows it so well. As this rather portentous rainstorm comes over, as they're kind of like, as I'm looking at these bones in the trench. So what Matthew has done is covered it up, because obviously we want to try and keep them as tidy as possible, not get them wet or anything like that. And then it comes to actually excavating the remains. And we realize that actually the skeleton goes back underneath the car park a bit. So we've got to widen out the trench a little bit to get in there. And then Joe and I are going to hop in to do the excavation. And we actually start the excavation on the 4th of September, 2012. And we start kind of going, we've started kind of like with the legs, and we get up to sort of hip level. Now, Philippa has brought in a film crew at this point. And I do a lot of television now, and I'm really used to film crews, and I love them, but they do get you to do stuff over and over again. And they're going, could you do this again? Can you do that? We'd like to get it from this angle, that kind of thing. And Joe and I are getting a bit worried, because what we don't want to do is uncover the skeleton, but not lift it all in the same day. We don't want to leave a skeleton uncovered overnight on the site. So it's decided that actually we're going to stop excavating this skeleton, and we go and excavate a little bit of charnel that's over in trench 3. And the thing is Joe's going to have to finish the skeleton on her own the following day, because I've got to go off to a forensics conference in Innsbruck. And I'm going, oh, darn it. Oh, but that's not going to be an exciting skeleton. That's going to be a 90-year-old friar who lived a nice long life and died in his bed. I won't miss any of this. I mean, we don't know anything. We've only just seen like up to like little bits of his legs at this point. So I'm joking, going, yeah, I'm not going to miss anything exciting. So the following day, Jo is excavating and she's working from the outside in. He's in a little bit of an odd position. So this skeleton's in a really odd position. So we've been doing his legs. And the soil in Leicester is very, very clayey. So what she's trying to do is she's trying to come down to this level. So she's kind of going through the clay with this, with a mattock trying to get down there. And it turns out that actually the skeletons, it's like it's in a bath. So it's kind of sitting up a little bit. So she's starting to come down on this skeleton. She's done the head, she's done the legs, she's done the arms. And now what she's trying to do is she's trying to work from the pelvis in a straight line up to the head. And she's kind of following the vertebrae. And then she realizes she can't find one of them. And, they sometimes tip to one side. So she kind of goes off to one side and she finds it. And then she finds the other one and it's going off in a curve. And she said the hair on the back of her neck went up because she realized what she might be looking at, because already she's seen what looks like battle injuries on the skull. And she'd been trying to not get too excited. She's like, well, maybe it's just a friar that met a really nasty end, or a patron or something like that. So she's starting to realize what she's looking at. So what she does is she calls out over Matthew Morris, because we need to get Richard Buckley. Now, Richard Buckley is apparently in trench 3. So over that wall, with somebody who's an expert on friaries, who's going, yep, we think you've got the layout right. That skeleton that Joe's excavating right now, yes, that does look like it's down at one end of the choir. So Matthew doesn't want to shout over that wall because we're trying to keep things calm. So what he does is he walks out of the car park, walks all the way around, walks up to trench 3 and kind of sidles up to Richard Buckley and says, you might want to come and have a look at something. And Richard B is apparently like, I have a guest here. I can't come right now. So Matthew's like, no, I really think you might want to come and have a look at something. So Richard B apparently is a bit like, fine. And he walks out of trench 3, walks all the way around, walks up to the side of the trench and looks down and sees this. Apparently what he said is not repeatable. We have got a youngish male, severe battle injuries, in the choir of the church of the Grey Friars. His hands are in a really unusual position. So they're right over left over his right hip. Now, Richard has been killed in battle, brought back and laid out for a couple of days. So rigor mortis has probably come and gone. So if they've moved him from that church to bury him in the friary, he's probably a bit floppy by this point. So they've probably tied his hands and his legs together. We couldn't find any evidence of any rope in the soil, but that looks like what it's like. The grave is really unusual. So that's another grave from the site, nice 90-degree sides in the friary. His grave is like a bath. So it's like they've buried him in a high status part of the church, but they buried him in a bit of a hurry. It's like they haven't finished the grave off. To also show you how close we came to never actually finding him, this is the modern disturbance. It comes to within 1 centimeter of his head. We think it's these Victorian builders. So there's a Victorian cellar just there. So we think if they had been that little bit more enthusiastic with their excavating, we probably never would have found Richard. So here he is laid out. So no other evidence of a withered arm or a limb. I mean, he is missing his feet. And but the number of people who've said to me, but he was defeated in battle. It's Richard III battle jokes. So, but Jo Appleby, so she can tell by looking at the ends of those bones, that has happened sometime after he's been buried, but before we found him. We think it's those Victorian builders. What they've done is they've gone through the ends. And it's like, we did that second excavation the following year. We kept our eyes peeled for a spare pair of feet, but we haven't found them. So if you're ever in Leicester and you come across a spare pair of feet, do let us know, because we don't know where they are. He has got very severe scoliosis of the spine and a lot of battle injuries on him. So I'll show you this in a second. So these are 2 of his vertebrae. I mean, because some people say, well, how do you know that curve of the spine isn't just because he's squished in the grave? It's not. So these are two of his vertebrae. They should be symmetrical. They're not. These would have been one on top of each other. You can see just how much it's worn here. So he would have probably been in a fair amount of pain. He has what's known as a Cobb angle, which is how they measure scoliosis, of about 75. So that's quite serious. Now, there was a lad who was, they do reenactments at the Bosworth battlefield, and he's the son of one of the reenactors. He has almost identical scoliosis to Richard III. And what a television company did was they did him bespoke armor. And he said it was great because it helped kind of keep him upright. I mean, because Richard is known to have been, you know, a keen dancer, really great in battle and so on and so forth. So it obviously wasn't holding him back, but probably over time, he would have found breathing more difficult on one side, that kind of thing. He has 11 injuries on him, and 9 of those are on his head. So that is starting to tell you that at some point, his helmet has come off. So he's got this one here. It's like they've kind of got the visor up, gone there. He's got a little one here and one on his chin. They think possibly that's trying to get the chin strap off. He's got these ones here. So this is work that Sarah Hainsworth did. So these are like little slice injuries. And there's a Welsh ballad. So there were Welshmen at the Battle of Bosworth, and there's a Welsh ballad that talks about shaving the boar's head. And that's exactly what this looks like. So this is where Sarah has come in. So she did micro CT scans. She does a lot of work on weapons because weapons apparently leave their own fingerprint. And she could get scans of 2 of those. And she could see it's the same weapon causing both of those injuries. So probably the third one as well. And thinks it's probably been done with something like a sword or a halberd. He's also got this one on the very top of his head, just there. And that probably, it hasn't gone all the way through, but it would have made him feel really woozy. It's thought to have been done with something like a rondel dagger. These are the killer blows. So this is the base of Richard's skull. So that's where the spinal column goes up. You've got this one here, thought to have been done with something like a halberd, a sword or a halberd. So you've got 7 centimeters of brain exposed. You've got this one here. You can actually see where it's nicked the top vertebrae, gone through, and it's gone through and hit the skull on the other side. So those 2 are the killer blows, but we don't know which came first because they don't overlay one another. He also had this one on the inside of one of his pelvic bones. And I remember Joe Appleby, it was like November 2012. She's like, I have no idea how he's managed to get one of these, like an injury on the inside of one of his pelvic bones. But what they did was they took the skeleton down to Leicester Royal Infirmary and did 3D scans and realized it must be something like a sword or a dagger that's gone up through the right buttock and gone up through the pelvis that way. Now we know that Richard has been stripped naked and flung over the back of a horse. And there's an account which talks about heaping humiliations upon the body. So perfectly possible that that's how it's happened. But reenactors will tell you that's a part of the body that's not well protected during battle. So it could have happened in another way. We basically don't know. So everything is pointing to these being the remains of Richard. So you have got somebody who's, you know, we know Richard's supposed to be buried in the choir of the Church of the Grey Friars. The skeleton is in the choir of the Church of the Grey Friars. He's male. He's coming back as age 30 to 34. He's gracile. We've got radiocarbon dates that are coming back as 1450 to 1540. So nicely bracketing when Richard is supposed to have died. We've got stable isotope, which is showing that this person has got a high status diet. Now, in this day and age, you can add DNA evidence to the pot, but that completely relies on the genealogical research because Richard left no known living descendants. And I need to, just like in any kind of forensic case, I need to get DNA from these remains and compare them with a known relative. Now, the thing is because of how our DNA is inherited, not just any old relative is going to do, I'm going to have to use 2 pieces of DNA that are passed down through the generations in a really simple way. The vast majority of our DNA is this really complex mixture of just that of our many ancestors. It's got a very complex pattern of inheritance, but you've got 2 pieces of DNA that are passed down through the generations in a really simple way. These are mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. So the Y chromosome, it put really simply, has a gene. It's known as sex-determining region Y, SRY. It switches on at about 6 weeks gestation and sends the fetus down the path to becoming male. So it's only passed down through the male line. So if I find people who are related to Richard through the male line, I can look at their Y chromosome and see if it matches the skeleton. Mitochondrial DNA, small circular piece of DNA, and that's in the egg. So us gals, we pass it down to all of our children, boys and girls, but only daughters can pass it on. It's in the egg. So it means if I can find people who are related to Richard through an all-female line, then I can do mitochondrial DNA. Now, it's been estimated that there are between 1 and 17 million people alive today who are descended from Richard's immediate family. And I like to say that it feels like most of them have emailed me by now, I think. Because you wouldn't believe the number of people who email me and they ring me. I have people who try to send me bits of themselves in the post because they would like me to test their DNA and see if they're related to Richard III. But obviously I can't. It has to be people who are related in a particular way. I'm not worried if you go up the tree sideways and down. As long as it's all boys, I can do Y. If it's through an all-female line, you can have boys at either end of that chain. That's totally fine. As long as you've got girls all the way through the rest of it, then I can do mitochondrial DNA. So male line relatives of Richard III, what you have to do to find living male line relatives of Richard III is you have to go up to Richard's great-granddad, Edmund, across to Edward III, who we met earlier, down through the house of John of Gaunt until you get down to this chap. So that's Henry Somerset. He's the 5th Duke of Beaufort. And what we were able to do is trace 5 living male line descendants who were willing to take part in the project. Now, I've been working on the Y chromosome since 1996, so it's like a very long time. So what I'm looking for is that I think these 5 guys should have identical or near identical Y chromosome types as each other. We know mutation happens, it's passed down through the generation. And that should match the skeleton if it's Richard, except for one tiny possible problem, which I knew about from my previous research. And that is that obviously that the Y chromosome that a man has is from his biological father, who might not be the father that he thinks it is. So if anything has gone on in the past, then there won't be a Y chromosome match. We know about 2 cases where children are born illegitimate and later legitimized. So we think we know who the father is. But if anything else has gone on here, and there's 19 generations in there, plenty of time for this to happen, there won't be a Y chromosome match. Mitochondrial DNA. So Richard has inherited his mitochondrial DNA from his mom, Cecily, who passed it to his eldest sister, Anne, who had a daughter down through the generations. So this is Michael Ibsen. He's Canadian like me, and I sidled up to him on the first day of the excavation to get a DNA sample off of him. He already knew that he was related to Richard III. So this bit of his family tree has already been published in a number of sources. So the main one being the Ruveny Roll, published in 1907. But what John Ashdown Hill did and a team in Canada was they were able to trace down to Joy Ibsen, so Michael's mum, who had sadly passed away several years previously, but Michael Ibsen was happy to give a DNA sample for me. Now, the only problem is nowhere was there the documentary evidence to prove that this tree was correct. And that was super important for me, because if I don't get a DNA match, how do I know it's not just because that tree is wrong? So this is where Kevin Schur and a team came in. And what they did was they traced every single piece of documentary evidence that was needed to prove that tree was right. And they also found somebody else. So this is a lady called Wendy Duldig. Seriously, it was a very exciting dig that we were on. It wasn't a dull dig at all. So what happens is so the team finds this name, Wendy Duldig. And so of course, Kevin and I are in his office and we're doing a quick search on Google and we find this phone number. And it's like the page looks quite old. And so it's like, well, she's probably not there. I was like, no. Yeah, he had to go off for a meeting. I said, look, I will grab a coffee. I'll go back to my office and I will give this number a call. What's the worst that happens? So I go back to my office and I call this lady up, and you can imagine how this goes. Hi, my name's Turi King and I'm from the University of Leicester, and we've been doing this excavation and we think we might have found the remains of Richard III. And I need people who are DNA matches that I might be able to use to do the analysis. And I think you might be one of them. She goes quiet for a second. She goes, am I on the radio? So I was like, no, this is for real or whatever. And then I got off the phone with her, and then Kevin rang her in the evening and talked to her. For the longest time, she didn't want to be known because she'd seen all the publicity that happened to Michael Ibsen. And she was like, I don't want to go through that. But she wanted to be able to come to the reinterment. So she's happy to be known now. She and Michael are 14th cousins, twice removed through the female line. So I'm expecting they're going to have identical mitochondrial DNA or nearly identical. And that should match the skeleton if it's Richard. So this is doing the modern DNA relatives is super duper easy. I just need to get a DNA sample from them and I can do the genetic analysis. I can do that anywhere I want. That was actually done at the University of Leicester, and I had a colleague do it blind in another institution as well. Ancient DNA, completely different kettle of fish. And that's because whilst we're alive, we've got really long lots of long strands of DNA. And there's things that come along and break our DNA, but our body just knits it back together again. But after death, that's not happening. So what happens is the DNA starts to break down into shorter and shorter fragments until eventually, and it's very damaged until eventually there is nothing left to sequence. Now, how quickly that happens is more about burial conditions than time. So what you need to do is you need to do all of this work in what's known as clean conditions, because all you need to do is you breathe on these remains and you're going to put your DNA all over it. It's going to swamp out any signal of any ancient DNA. So this is Joe and I excavating in what's known as clean conditions, the irony being that we're in a trench covered in mud. But anyways, we've got our like face masks and our hairnets and the full CSI suits. This is me wiggling a tooth out of Richard's mandible to be able to take away for DNA analysis. And then I went and did the work in 2 separate labs. So this was at the University Paul Sabatier in Toulouse, working in the lab of Patricia Ballaresque, and then up at the University of York with Mickey Hoffreiter doing the work up there. So this is part of the mitochondrial DNA sequence from the work that I did. It's not everything I did because it's too long to put on a slide. What you're interested in here is not in the heights of these peaks. You're interested in the sequence of those 4 different colors, because those are the 4 different building blocks of DNA. So this is a bit of mitochondrial DNA sequence from Michael. That's the same bit from Wendy Duldig. And that's the same bit from skeleton 1. The one we found on the very first day of the excavation. And I did much more work with this, and we got this lovely, great match for the mitochondrial DNA. So the mitochondrial DNA is pointing to these being the remains of Richard. So what happened was Philippa had been working with this film crew. They wanted to put a television program out on a particular day. So I hadn't finished the work. I still had a lot more to do, but I had done this little bit. But if you ever watch the press conference, which went out live on the BBC, you look at all, I mean, just look at the film crews. You'll notice that I say the DNA is pointing to these being the remains of Richard III, because I still had a ton of work to do. And as a scientist, this was a really difficult position to be in, because normally what you do is you do all of the work, you write it up. It goes for peer review, and then people might go, oh, this is great, or you need to do more work or whatever. And then eventually it becomes published. Here, I was essentially slightly publishing by press. So what we'd had to do was we had to ring up the big journal Nature and say, look, this is the issue. And they said, you can give the punchline, but you can't say how you got there. So I still had to finish the work on this. It was a bit of a strange position to be put into. Male line, completely different kettle of fish. So here you've got our 5 living male line relatives, and there wasn't a DNA match. Actually, there must be at least 2 false paternity events where the biological father is not the recorded father. And one of them was recent. So I'm looking at these 5, and one of them is not matching the other 4. And I'm going, okay, have I made a mistake here? I've done, I've checked everything. I've got a colleague to do it blind. And it's like, okay, let's go and talk to this chap and just see if they know anything. And I'd like to get another DNA sample just to be absolutely sure, because it's taking 10 years off my life. So bless him, he goes, yeah, come and talk to us. Come and see me at my mom's house. So I was like, okay, we might be about to let the cat out of the bag with anything. But bless, they were absolutely lovely, went and kind of explained about some of the issues. And then mom goes, there always was this story that so-and-so wasn't actually the son of so-and-so. So they knew, they just hadn't mentioned anything. But we had uncovered that actually this family story was actually true. So we think we know where that is. Now, the other 4, they match each other. That is telling me that's Henry Somerset's Y chromosome type. That's the type I'm looking for in Richard. But there isn't a DNA match there either. Now, I'm not worried. So we know somewhere in these 19 generations, there must be at least 1, if not more, false paternities. And it's interesting because if it's in particular parts of the tree, so if it's anywhere in here, that starts to affect the Yorkist Plantagenet kings. Did they have a proper claim to the throne? So that's Edward IV, Richard III. If you start to come down here, you start to affect the Lancastrian Plantagenet kings, so Henry IV, V, and VI. Anywhere in these 2 generations, and you start to affect the Tudors. And we put this in the paper saying, look, we don't know where this has happened, but if it's in particular parts of the tree, it could have implications for the historical monarchy. I'm not surprised remotely because I've done a lot of research on this previously. We know this happens about 1 to 2% per generation. It doesn't affect the overall identification. So we do a Bayesian statistical analysis. So what we have to do is we have to go, okay, this is what happens in any forensics case. You bring all of the strands of evidence together, not just DNA on its own. You have to bring all of the strands of evidence. And we are going to be really conservative in our approach because we want to bias it at all times towards it not being Richard III. So remains are found in the choir of the Church of the Grey Friars. Is it him? Or is it somebody purely by chance who fits everything we know about him, but it's not him? So you have to start going, well, how often do you find males in high status parts of churches? Well, that's about 1 in 2. How often do you find them age 30 to 34? Well, that's about 1 in 6. You go 1/2 times 1/30, 1/6. And then you go severe scoliosis might 1/212. So you do this for every single strand of evidence. Now the stable isotope data fit, but this is showing a high status diet, but it's somebody who's buried in a high status part of the church. So that is circular and it's starting to bias it towards it being Richard. We are trying to bias it towards it not being Richard. So we take that evidence out. Y chromosome doesn't match. We have to include that in the evidence. Mitochondrial DNA does match though, and it matches with 2 female line relatives, but even then we're getting no hits in any databases worldwide, but even then we kind of, to be conservative, we just say 1 in 10,000. When you do that, if you take all of the strands of evidence together, you calculate what's known as a likelihood ratio, and the likelihood ratio was 6.7 million to 1. That this was somebody purely by chance and not Richard III. So that translates to 99.999 to 99.99999% that these are the remains of Richard III. Essentially, the evidence is overwhelming that these are the remains of Richard. And I was so proud because I had been working with this amazing bunch of people. I had worked for 2 years. We don't have clean labs at Leicester, so I was having to go and travel to these labs, and I'd go up on a Sunday night and I'd work all week and I'd come back down on a Friday, see the kids for the weekend, and then go back up again. I lost 2 stone on the Richard III diet. 2 stone. So what is that? So that's going to be like about 30 pounds or something like that. I mean, it was just, I was in the lab all of the time. It was nuts. So I was really proud when this went out. But the only thing the press were interested in was this. That break in the male line. Oh my goodness, I spent so much time. It went all over the world. And then that came out. So the Jeremy, it's a bit like Jerry Springer kind of show is what it was. That was the only thing the press were really interested in, was should the Queen be on the throne? And I had to keep saying to them, look, we don't know where this has happened. And, the crown, Henry Tudor takes the crown by force. He's from a line that's banned from ever taking it. So, we don't know where this is, and it wouldn't affect the Queen, but that was the main thing that the press were interested in. So Richard was reinterred in Leicester Cathedral, and at the time, Benedict Cumberbatch was, filming Richard III. So he's filming this series called The Hollow Crown. So he was invited. He's actually related to Richard III through 2 different routes, but sadly not in an all male or an all female line. So I couldn't sidle up to him to go and get a DNA sample, sadly. 2 people who are also related to Richard III, but who were not invited. So they're both descended from John of Gaunt. But the thing is, so this is a chap called Adam Rutherford. He's quite a well-known science presenter does stuff for BBC Radio 4. He's a friend of mine. He did a back of the envelope calculation. So we know how many great-grandchildren that Edward III had, and you can kind of project forward as to how many, offspring he would have had by this point. The chances of somebody with broadly British ancestry not being descended from Edward III is a really tiny number. So Richard left Leicester Cathedral left the University of Leicester rather, on the 22nd of March, 2015. This is me and Joe and Sarah laying roses on the coffin. He was then taken out to Bosworth Field and brought back into Leicester. There are 30,000 people lining the streets, many of them throwing white roses onto the cortege as it went past. He then laid in repose for about 3 days so people could pay their respects. I love this because it goes past the King's News. There were queues for 5 hours for people to go and file past the coffin. It was a huge spectacle in Leicester. There they go. And then he was reinterred on the 26th of March, 2015. So he is now under this huge stone tomb. So nobody's getting in there anytime soon. So the lovely thing about this project is the lovely Richard Buckley, who recently retired. So he kept saying, if we find Richard III, I will eat my hat. So you know what archaeologists are like. At the end of the excavation, there's some little cake hats. And that is Richard Dooley eating one. So there you go. So there's a quick gossipy tour through the Richard III project. I have a website if you want to have a look. I do all kind of various bits and things I'm working on. I'm on Twitter. I have a YouTube channel about various things that I'm working on because I do quite a lot of telly and stuff like that in the UK. And I've also got a podcast channel. So shout if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer questions.
The tooth that you took out.
Yeah.
His front tooth?
No, that was already gone. So I mean, it could have easily fallen out if he's in Bath and he's been bonked. Yeah, no, so I'm taking molars to do that. Because so there's a kind of a hierarchy of kind of bits of the body that are best to go for, and teeth are really good for getting DNA out. Yeah. Yeah.
That seems like kind of odd. It's not part of the modern disturbance, or was that the way it was placed?
It was the way it was placed. So he was in a really unusual position. So you know what? It's like they put him in a bath. It's like they kind of dug this grave in a bit of a hurry and they didn't kind of finish the sides off. Now, Richard's been laid out for a couple of days. It's August. He's been taken and he seems to be buried quite sort of hurriedly. He might have been getting a bit whiffy by this point. We don't know. It's like they did it in a hurry. He's in a high status part of the church, but they've not finished the grave off. So it's like he's almost sitting in a bath, which is why his head was in this really weird position, slightly up from the rest of the body. So, no, so I don't think so. I mean, we don't think so. We think he's just done it in a bit of a hurry. Yeah. Yeah.
Was he lost for so long? And I mean, is that common that people are built over and that like there was?
It was so it's the dissolution of the friaries. So this is 1538. Henry Tudor is having a spat with the Pope in Rome, and he decides he tears down all the friaries, virtually all of them. And then the land is bought, it's built on over time, but we're super lucky because where he was, they never put buildings on top of him. It was a car park. It was gardens and then a car park. But there was a lot of, I mean, it was already known, he's probably under there somewhere, but the precise location has been lost. But we know that friaries tend to be next to main roads because of, entrance places. But it's interesting where they put him. They put him in the choir. So that would not be accessible to the public. So it can't become a shrine. But we know friary layouts. We know they're likely to be close to main roads. So this is where the archaeologists come in because they know all of this kind of stuff. Also, we've got a fairly limited space that we can actually excavate. So what Richard B wants to do is run these two long, thin trenches because we know that the main walls run east-west. So if you run two staggered trenches north-south, hopefully what you'll start to do is cross main walls, and then you can start to orientate yourself because that's our main thing. Can we find the friary buildings? I mean, the thinking is maybe we do a 2-week recce dig. We see if we can find the friary. Maybe we can start to interpret what we found. Maybe we can then start to work out from that a map. Maybe next year we could go and home in on where we think the church might be. Little did we, and do you want to know what? So you know that picture of the car park? So when the digger is coming in, so here's me starting as an archaeologist in this country, a digger. Oh my, what are you guys doing, right? Normally it's like painstakingly, you're going down in these layers. So this digger comes in, and what's happening is with that kind of wall, Matthew Morse is like, oh, I need a place to put a spoil heap. Can the digger move over just like 50 centimeters? And if it hadn't, we never would have hit the ends of his legs. Just the luck, the day, yeah, time, and so lucky that it was ULAS involved because they know downtown Leicester. They're used to digging through these like fairly difficult layers and stuff like that. So yeah, just completely lucked out. So many bits of it. Yeah. Yeah. So they did do that. So this is the thing, it's like how much to include. So they did ground penetrating radar a year previously. And Richard Buckley was saying, look, it's unlikely to be helpful because it's urban archaeology, so quite disturbed. It was really good for showing where not to excavate because it showed you where like the sewage pipes were and the power lines and things like that. Don't go through there. So it was great for that, but didn't really show anything of any use for that. Yeah. Yeah.
What are some of the other like historical mysteries you'd like to have solved?
Well, okay, so the number one question, no one's asked me, right? The Princess in the Tower case. So, do you guys know, so the Tower of London in the late 1600s, they are doing renovating the Tower of London. And the story is that the prince is in the tower. So this thing about the two boys, their last scene in the princes in the tower. Now, at the time, the tower is like a royal residence. So it's not like they've been locked up in the tower type thing. But they're not seen after kind of like late summer 1483, I think. And then they're doing renos in the late 1600s, and they're kind of digging up under the staircase apparently, and they're putting stuff on the spoil heap. And then suddenly they go, oh, hey, look, there's bones there. That could be the princes in the tower. So they're kept apparently at somebody's house. And then they're eventually put into an urn in Westminster Abbey. And in the 1930s, they're opened and they're examined. And it's really interesting if you read the report, because by paragraph kind of 5 or something, they're already calling them Edward and Richard. But you know, this is the 1930s. They haven't got DNA. You can't even properly sex a skeleton when they're that age. So I have done a podcast actually about this, about if somebody was going to do this study, and it would be amazing to do, you would do a holistic study, and you would also take it in a very stepwise, non-sensationalist manner. So you would lay the skeletons out and you would have a look at them. But the very first thing you would do is radiocarbon dating, because it's destructive. All these things are destructive after a while. So you want to minimize the destruction to the skeleton. So if you did radiocarbon dating and they're coming back as Anglo-Saxon or Roman or whatever they could easily do, you would stop right there because it's not the boys. But if the evidence is slowly building, you would go through, you could do DNA now. We've got Richard's DNA, male line relative. We've got female line relative. So we've got, there'd be the possibility of doing this sort of thing now, but you have to get permission of the monarch and the Dean of Westminster. And my understanding is they're not keen. It would be a really interesting project to do. My suspicion is this is probably not the boys. I mean, there've been other skeletons that have been found in the tower. So, we don't know what happened to them. Yeah. Online thing. You want me to do online? Hang on, let me come out of this. And then, wait a minute, I need to go into Zoomy things. Wait a minute. Hang on.
Turi, there aren't any questions online yet.
They're not. Oh, okay. Groovy. Okay. I was gonna say, woo! From above, no questions online. Yeah, shout. So we didn't. So yeah, it was we had money to do 6. So we actually, I think there was only 3 eventually excavated aside from Richard, all females, I understand. Yeah. So patrons or wives of patrons who were in the friary. Yeah. Yeah.
So say something about the movie that was made. But I'm curious.
I was so sad for about 3 days after I saw it, because it was so not what I recognized and so unnecessary. I think one of the things about this project was just how lovely and wonderful it was. It brought non-academics and academics together. And I think the thing is no one person could have done it. It required the expertise of so many people to do it. I mean, so many people were involved in this project to make it the success that it really was. And I think that story was so fantastic that I was so sad when I saw that. There was so much of it I didn't recognize. It wasn't funded completely by the Richard III. In fact, it was overwhelmingly funded by the University of Leicester. I felt that it was very sad the way that Richard Taylor was treated in it. And there is now, I don't know if you know that, but there's been a legal case in the UK for defamation, and that the judge has decided there is a case to be answered for. It was sad and unnecessary, I felt, because I was and I am still so proud of this project. And I think the lovely story that it was enough.
We now have a question online.
Yeah, so so Channel 4 did 2 documentaries that were following Philippa, essentially. And they won awards. One of them won an award, I think. And she got an MBE in the end. John Ashdown Hill got an MBE in the end. So with this whole idea that she wasn't recognized, again, I kind of go, oh, there's a lot. And I am, as you know, you saw, I'm at pains to talk about everybody's involvement and the fact that it took so many people to do this. And we all had our own little parts to it, which we can be proud of. And I think there's more than enough glory to go around, really. Yeah.
Turi, there's a question about the missing feet. Was it common for the feet to be cut off in battle, or do we know anything about Richard's feet?
So we think it's those, we think it's the Victorian builders. So Joe can tell by looking at the ends of the bows, that's happened after he's been buried, but before we have found him. So to our knowledge, it's nothing to do with the battle. I couldn't tell you rates of battle, like feet chopping off. I have no idea. But we know that it was nothing to do with the battle. We think, as I say, that there's that outbuilding, and we think the Victorians have probably gone through the ends of the feet. The soil in Leicester is very clayey. It probably just looked like pebbles and they've just chucked it. But we don't know where they are. Yeah.
So I think we'll close up the questions there. As those of you who've come to our talks before, we tend to do a bit of a raffle for books. There are 2 books this month. We have Christopher Gerard's Medieval Archaeology, Understanding Traditions and Contemporary Approaches. And then we have Colin Renfrew and Paul Bond's Archaeology Theories, Methods, and Practice, kind of the gold standard of textbooks on archaeology. So yeah, hopefully you grabbed the ticket as you came in, and we will ask.
Such a very